The first note of the orchestra had barely sounded when she heard it. She was standing at the edge of the Ashworth Ballroom, beneath the third of the 5 chandeliers in the gown she had turned twice, and still could not quite make new. The hem sat a 1/4 inch too short on her left side where the seam had given during the retrimming, and she had spent the better part of that afternoon with a needle and ivory thread trying to convince it otherwise. It had not been entirely convinced. The silk was the color it had been 5 years ago, which was to say it was the color of old cream rather than fresh, and it caught the candlelight in a way that made its age more visible rather than less. She was 26 years old and a widow of 14 months, and she had not wished to come at all. Lady Philippa Hurst said it to the woman beside her, without lowering her voice. She rarely troubled to lower her voice, having spent 40-odd years in rooms that arranged themselves attentively around whatever she chose to say. "Poor Mrs. Cavendish," Lady Philippa said. "Still in the season. Still in that dress." The woman beside her, whose name Cecily Cavendish did not know, made a small, soft sound that meant agreement. Cecily did not move. She had learned in the 14 months since her husband's death that stillness was its own kind of armor. She held her gloved hands together at her waist and kept her eyes on the dancers, and she breathed in through her nose and counted to 6, which was the number her mother had taught her and which she still trusted. And she let the words settle somewhere. They would not show. The room was full. Sir Edmund Hurst, Lady Philippa's eldest, had engaged the orchestra for a full evening of dancing, and the Ashworth House on Grosvenor Square was one of the finest in London, with a ballroom that could accommodate 200 without crowding, and which tonight held something closer to 140, arranged in their proper configurations of rank and day-crack. Expectation. The women were dressed in organza and silk and sprigged muslin and worked lace, and the men wore dark coats and white cravats and moved with the particular confidence of people who had never needed to count the threads in their hems. The flowers on the mantelpiece alone had probably cost more than Cecily's quarterly allowance, which was to say, the allowance that Mr. Cavendish's will had provided, which was to say the £40 a year she had been managing with a precision that would have astonished everyone in the room who did not know what £40 was actually worth. She had come because her sister had asked her to come, and because Agnes had said it would be good for her to see people, and because Cecily had found, in recent months, that refusing Agnes required more energy than simply agreeing and putting on the old cream silk. The Duke of Alderton stood at the far end of the ballroom. She had not been looking for him. He simply existed in a room the way weather existed outdoors, as a fact one could not choose to ignore. He was 34 years old, though he looked, in this light, a year or 2 older, with the kind of face that suggested he had arrived at a settled gravity without having needed to work particularly hard for it. He was tall and broad in the shoulders under his navy tailcoat, with a high white cravat and dark hair that had been cut with care and worn without vanity, and he was standing slightly apart from the small group to his left, with an expression that said he had attended this sort of gathering before, and had not found the previous ones to have exceeded their promises. His name was William Alderton, the Duke of Alderton. His Grace to half the room, and she suspected, the subject of considerable planning by the other half. He was unmarried. He had been unmarried for 3 years since the death of his first Duchess, and the season had developed strong opinions about what he ought to do about it. Cecily looked away from him. She was not in that conversation. She was a widow on £40 a year, with a retrimmed gown, and a sister who had arranged this evening, with the best of intentions and no particular plan. If you have ever stood at the edge of a room and felt the whole of it arrange itself around your absence, you know something of what Cecily Cavendish felt that night. Stay close. She looked back at the dancers. Agnes appeared at her elbow with a glass of negus she had not asked for, and a look of determined optimism that she had been wearing since their arrival. "You look well," Agnes said. "You are very kind," Cecily said. "I am accurate," Agnes said. Cecily accepted the glass because it gave her hand something to hold, and because Agnes was watching her with the worried sort of attention that was harder to endure than Lady Philippa's commentary. Her sister was 4 years younger, and married well and had 4 children, and a husband who came home every evening and found them there, and she loved Cecily with a thoroughness that occasionally pressed like a thumb on a bruise. "Lady Philippa Hurst noticed you," Agnes said, her voice dropping. "She did," Cecily agreed. Agnes opened her mouth and then closed it again, which was unusual, and Cecily appreciated the restraint. There was nothing useful to say about Lady Philippa noticing her. The woman had been noticing Cecily in one way or another since before Thomas's death, when she had been Mrs. Black Cavendish, with a respectable but modest household in Kensington, and had intensified her attention considerably since, now that Cecily was Mrs. Bide. Cavendish without the household, the income, the social standing, or the husband who had conferred the modest version of all three. The season had a name for what Cecily was, though it rarely used the word directly. A widow without means was a particular kind of problem, the kind the season preferred to manage by arranging her disappearance from the parts of itself that mattered. She was still technically received. She was still technically eligible to attend. She simply found season after season that the conversation shortened when she approached, that the invitations arrived later, and for the less essential events, and that she occupied a distinct category in the hierarchy's accounting, somewhere between object of pity and cautionary example. Thomas had died 14 months ago. A fever, the doctor had said, as though a fever were not its own small catastrophe. He had been 42 years old, and not unkind, and Cecily had grieved him in the way one grieves a person who has treated one with consistent decency, without ever quite learning the language of one's particular interior. The grief had been real. What had followed, the grief had been more complicated, and had involved the solicitor and the will, and the discovery that the modest household in Kensington had been less financially secure than it had appeared, and the £40, and the room she now occupied in Agnes's house, where she was warmly welcomed and where she went to bed each night, conscious of being a guest, rather than a resident. The Duke of Alderton was watching her. She did not notice it the first time, because she was not looking at him. She noticed it the second time because Agnes had shifted her weight and made a small sound that drew Cecily's eyes across the room, and when she looked, he was already looking away. His profile was turned toward the group on his left. He appeared to be listening to something Sir Edmund Hurst was saying, with the expression of a man who was listening without finding it particularly necessary to respond. His jaw was set in the particular way of a person who had developed discipline, overexpression, as a practical skill, rather than an affectation. A small scar ran faintly through his left brow, angling toward his temple, the remnant of something old. His hands were still at his sides. He did not look back at her. Agnes said something about the supper room, and Cecily said something agreeable, and they moved together toward the edge of the crowd. And Cecily told herself that she had imagined it, and applied herself to the negus, which was warm and lightly spiced, and considerably more pleasant than the rest of the evening. The following week was the occasion of Lady Ashworth's card party, and Cecily attended it for the same reason she had attended the Hurst ball. Agnes had asked. Lady Ashworth's drawing room was smaller and hotter, and the card tables were arranged in a pattern that meant one was inevitably seated near someone one would have preferred not to be seated near. Cecily found herself at a table for whist, with Sir Edmund Hurst, a Mrs. Delaney, whose cheerfulness she found personally heroic given the circumstances, and a fourth player who arrived late and pulled out the empty chair and turned out to be the Duke of Alderton. He sat down without ceremony and named his preference for a partner and accepted his cards and played them with a precision that was not showy and a consistency that was not accidental. He said very little. When he spoke, it was to the game. Cecily played carefully. She had learned whist from her father, who had been a thorough and methodical teacher, and she played it now the same way she had learned it, with attention to what had been shown and what had not. She won 2 of the 4 hands. The Duke won 1. Mrs. Delaney won 1 with a surprised delight that was entirely genuine. After the 3rd hand, when Sir Edmund had gone to refresh his glass, the Duke said, without looking up from his cards, "Your father taught you." "It was not a question he did," Cecily said. "He was a Northumberland man." She looked up then. He was still studying his cards, his face composed. "He was," she said. "You knew him?" "I knew of him. We shared a solicitor some years ago." He set one card down. He spoke of a daughter who played whist the way one ought to play whist, by which he meant methodically and without flourish. I assumed he was describing himself. He was describing both of us, Cecily said. The Duke looked up at that, and for a moment she had his full attention, which was a different thing from being looked at. It was specific. It registered the person rather than the position. She felt it in her sternum and then willed herself not to feel it, because feeling things about the Duke of Alderton's attention was precisely the kind of foolishness she could not afford. He looked back at his cards. Sir Edmund returned. The evening continued. What she did not yet know, as she rode home in Agnes's carriage with her gloved hands in her lap, and the night streets of London moving past the window, was that the Duke had asked about her father 4 days before Lady Ashworth's party. He had found the shared solicitor's name in his own correspondence, and made an inquiry that he would not have made if something at the Hurst ball had not already pricked his notice. She did not know this. She knew only that she had held a conversation with a man who had spoken of her father as though her father had existed, and that this was the kindest thing the evening had offered. It was enough to put her to sleep. The ball at Clarendon House was 3 weeks later, and by then the season had formed its opinions. Lady Philippa held court at one end of the supper-room, and the women around her had the particular arrangement of shoulders that meant they were sharing something worth sharing. Cecily heard her name in the way one hears one's own name even when it is not spoken loudly, and she moved past without slowing, which was the correct choice, and found a seat near the window, which was cold and therefore unoccupied, and sat in it with her hands in her lap and her back correctly straight. A young woman appeared at her side. Miss Priscilla Lennox, who was 19 and the current season's foremost candidate for the title of Diamond, and who wore white silk worked with silver thread, and appeared to have been designed specifically for this particular ballroom in this particular light. She sat down without invitation, which was either good breeding or its opposite, and she looked at Cecily with the frank assessment of a person who had been told things and was deciding how to weigh them. "They say you were quite the figure before," Miss Lennox said. "Do they?" Cecily said. "Lady Philippa says you have made yourself an embarrassment by continuing to attend." She said it in the tone of someone reporting rather than endorsing, which Cecily granted was more considerate than it might have been. "She says a woman in your position ought to have retired from society." Cecily looked at her hands. "Lady Philippa has always had definite views. She also says the Duke of Alderton was pointed toward you at Lady Ashworth's, and that you took advantage of the proximity." Miss Lennox paused. "I don't believe that." Cecily looked up. "No?" "You played better than he did," Miss Lennox said simply. "I was watching from the other table. You won more hands. A woman taking advantage of proximity does not usually bother to win." There was a quality in this that Cecily recognized as the particular clarity that had not yet been educated out of the girl, and she was grateful for it in the way one is grateful for an unexpected window in a closed room. "You are kind," Cecily said. "I am accurate," Miss Lennox said, and something in the echo made Cecily look at her again, and for the first time that evening she almost smiled. The Duke found her at the edge of the terrace, 20 minutes later. She had stepped outside for the cold, which was genuine, and because the window seat had become occupied by 2 of Lady Philippa's particular friends, who had looked at her in a way that made the stone terrace in November feel preferable to the warm supper-room. She stood with her back to the ballroom doors and her face to the garden where the boxwood was clipped in shapes that someone maintained with care, and she held herself against the cold the way one holds one's self against things that cannot be changed. He came through the doors and stopped a short distance to her right and said nothing. After a moment he said, "You will take a chill." "I'm not cold," she said, which was partly true. She was cold in her hands and face, but the cold in her chest was of an older and less temperature-related variety. "Come inside," he said. She looked at him. His expression was composed, but there was something in the set of his mouth that was not indifference. "Your Grace," she said, "I am quite all right where I am." "I did not say you were not all right," he said. "I said you will take a chill." He paused. "The supper-room is less managed than it was an hour ago. Lady Philippa Hurst has moved to the card tables." There was something in this that was not coincidence, and which he was not pretending was coincidence, and Cecily felt the knowledge of it settle into her ribs like a coal finding its place in the grate. "You are watching the room," she said. "I am watching several things," he said, and opened the door. She went inside. Not because he had asked, and not because the cold had defeated her, and not because she had nowhere else to go, though all three of those things were true to varying degrees. She went inside because he had noticed the managed supper room, which meant he had noticed what was managing it, which meant that on some level he had taken account of her situation in a way that did not flatten it into pity. And this was the second time in 3 weeks he had done something that acknowledged the actual texture of her life rather than the season's summary of it. She was not a woman who could afford to be careless with such things. The night deepened. She danced twice, once with Agnes's husband, and once with an elderly baronet who danced with every woman he found, unpartnered, as a matter of principle which Cecily had always privately admired. She ate 2 small tarts from the supper table, and drank 1 glass of champagne, and spoke with Mrs. Delaney about a lending library they both used, and altogether, the evening became something she had not expected, which was tolerable. The Duke did not ask her to dance. He moved through the rooms with the ease of a man who did not need to perform his comfort in social settings, and once she saw him in conversation with Sir Edmund, and once she saw him refuse a glass of something from a footman, and once from across the room, she caught him looking in her direction. He looked away before she could be certain. She told herself she was being foolish. There were 12 days between the Clarendon House ball and the evening that changed everything, and in those 12 days she was visited twice at Agnes's house. The first visit was from Lady Philippa Hurst, who came with a calling card and a purpose. Lady Philippa sat in Agnes's blue drawing-room in a gown that had cost more than Cecily's entire wardrobe, and she folded her hands, and she said what she had come to say with the precision of a woman who had thought carefully about how to say it. "You are a sensible woman, Mrs. Cavendish, and I will speak to you as one." She set her card on the table between them. "The Duke of Alderton is considering a second marriage. The season has produced a suitable candidate." A small, careful pause. "Miss Lennox is 19 and comes from an excellent family, and has the kind of future that a second marriage for a man of his station ought to secure. She is quite without complication." Cecily said nothing. "You have been seen in conversation with His Grace on several occasions. I do not doubt that these conversations were innocent. I am asking you to ensure that they remain so, by confining yourself to the kind of interactions appropriate to your current station." Lady Philippa looked at her with the expression of a woman who was being very kind about something she considered obvious. A man like Alderton does not require a widow with no prospects and a returned gown. Whatever you may imagine you have observed in his behavior, you are mistaken. He is courteous. It is not the same thing as interest. She stood. She took her gloves. "It would be uncomfortable for everyone," Lady Philippa said at the door, "if you continued in this manner." Cecily sat in the blue drawing-room for a long time after the door had closed. She sat with her hands in her lap, and the calling card on the table, and the silence of Agnes's house around her, and she felt the shape of the thing Lady Philippa had said, which was not as cruel as it might have been, and which was therefore in some ways more difficult to bear. Because cruelty, at least, offered the dignity of resistance, and this offered only the cold, flat surface of probability. Lady Philippa was not wrong about the objective facts. Cecily was a widow without means or prospects. She had no fortune, no family connections that carried weight, no youth left to trade on, no position that could confer usefulness on a duke arranging a second marriage. Whatever she had thought she had observed in William Alderton's behavior, it was quite likely what Lady Philippa had said it was: courtesy. The man was courteous. It was a noted feature of his character, and not particular to her. She went to bed. The second visitor, 6 days later, was the Duke's solicitor. His name was Mr. Allister Fenn, and he came with a letter and an explanation. Her late husband's solicitor, a man named Cartwright, had been, at the time of Thomas Cavendish's death, in possession of a document that he had not disclosed. The document was a codicil to Thomas's will, signed and witnessed, which had been prepared 2 months before Thomas's death, and which altered the terms of the settlement in a way that would have materially changed what Cecily had received. Mr. Fenn had come into possession of this information through his office's records of the shared file from long ago, when the Duke of Alderton's late father had employed Cartwright, briefly. The Duke, upon reviewing those records for unrelated purposes, had found Cartwright's name in a context that caused him to investigate further. Cecily read the letter carefully. The codicil provided for £150 a year, not a fortune. Not even comfort, by the season's standards. £150 a year was, however, the difference between a guest in her sister's house and a woman with her own sitting room and the ability to close a door that belonged to her. She read it 3 times. Mr. Bibia, Fenn said with considerable tact, that the matter would require the involvement of Cartwright and potentially the courts, and that it might take several months to resolve, and that the Duke of Alderton had instructed him to tell her that the costs of pursuit would be attended to from his Grace's office. Cecily set the letter down. He found this while reviewing his father's old files, she said. Yes, madam, Mr. Fenn said. He did not inform me himself, she said. He felt, Mr. Prowl. Fenn said carefully that the information would be better delivered through proper channels, and that its reception would be cleaner if it arrived without his involvement. A pause. He also felt that you would prefer to receive it that way. She sat with this for a moment. He had been right. She would have preferred it that way. And she resented very slightly that he had known that. And she was more grateful than she had words for that he had done it anyway. Thank you, she said to Mr. Fenn. Lux, please convey my thanks to His Grace. Mr. Fenn bowed and left, and Cecily went to find Agnes. She told Agnes only a portion of what she had learned, because the full shape of it was still settling in her, and she did not yet have language for all of it. She said there was legal business that needed attending, and Agnes asked sensible questions, and held her hand for a moment at the end and said nothing effusive. That evening, Cecily sat at the small writing desk in her room, and she thought about what it meant that a man had gone through old correspondence to find a name, and had sent inquiries, and had paid a solicitor, and had arranged for the information to arrive properly rather than conveniently. She thought about the terrace at Clarendon House and the card party, and the particular quality of his attention at the whist table. She thought about Lady Philippa's calling card still on the blue drawing-room table where she had not yet moved it. A woman in her position did not permit herself to think past the immediate practical horizon. Punton, a woman in her position did not arrange her heart around a man who was under active consideration by a polished 19-year-old with a great fortune, and a mother who knew how to organize a season. She put out the candle. The night of the Grosvenor assembly was cold and clear, and the rooms were very full, and Cecily arrived with Agnes and her husband, and stood for a moment at the top of the staircase looking at the assembled company below, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the particular sensation of not wanting to be invisible. It surprised her. She had grown so accustomed to managing invisibility that she had stopped noticing when she was doing it. She descended the stairs. Lady Philippa was present. She stood with 3 women of her particular circle near the east windows, and she saw Cecily arrive, and her expression settled into the particular composition of a woman who has spoken and has not been heeded. Miss Lennox was present. She stood near the orchestra with 2 other young women, and she caught Cecily's eye across the room, and gave a small nod that was either acknowledgement or apology, or possibly both. The Duke was present. He stood with a group that included Lord Harwich and 2 other men whose names Cecily could not immediately recall, and he was listening to something with his usual economy of expression, and he did not appear to have noticed her arrival. The first set was called. Cecily danced with Agnes's husband and with the elderly baronet who had danced with her at Clarendon, and who said pleasant things about the weather, and she stood for 2 dances at the edge of the floor with a glass of lemonade, and watched the room arrange itself around its usual hierarchies. Lady Philippa spoke to Miss Lennox's mother at some length, with the quality of attention that indicated purpose. Miss Lennox danced with Lord Harwich, and then with a young man whose name Cecily did not know, and then stood waiting for the next set with the particular patience of someone who had been told they would not need to wait long. Cecily saw the moment Lady Philippa steered the Duke toward the Lennox corner of the room. It was done with the smoothness of a woman who had been arranging these geometries for 40 years. A word in his ear, a hand briefly at his elbow. A gesture that offered him the obvious direction. He went because he was courteous, and he stood with Miss Lennox's mother and exchanged words that Cecily could not hear, and could not prevent herself from watching. She looked away. She set her lemonade on the nearest surface, and she thought, with some clarity, that she ought to have stayed home. Agnes had meant well. Agnes always meant well. The world was full of people who meant well, and who had arranged its machinery without any particular consultation of the people the machinery was processing. She was moving toward the outer corridor when she heard Lady Philippa's voice, carrying with perfect social deniability to the three women nearest her. Mrs. Cavendish has been making rather a pointed study of His Grace all evening. One feels for her, one truly does, a threadbare widow, with 30 feet of ambition and nothing to support it. The three women did not laugh. They made the sound that was worse than laughter, which was the murmur of considered agreement. Cecily did not stop moving. She found the outer corridor, which was mercifully empty of anyone she knew, and she stood beside a marble table with a vase of hothouse flowers, and she breathed in through her nose and counted to 6, and then she counted to 6 again, and then she stood very still and thought about the codicil. Fen and the particular way the Duke had looked at her over a whist hand, and Lady Philippa's card on the table, and the old cream silk, and £40, and the 150 that might become 40 plus 150, and she thought about her father who had taught her to play whist methodically, and without flourish, and what it would mean to him that she was standing in a marble corridor counting to 6, so that she did not show anything on her face in a room that had decided her face was not worth watching. She was going to collect Agnes and go home. She turned. The Duke was standing in the corridor. He had come from the direction of the ballroom. And he was alone, and he stopped when he saw her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "They are about to announce the next set," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was just leaving." He looked at her. He looked at her in the particular way she had first noticed at the whist table, and had spent 3 weeks trying to find a plausible alternative explanation for. The way that was specific and undeflectable, and registered the person rather than the category. "Mrs. Cavendish," he said. A pause. His hands were still at his sides. "I heard what Lady Philippa said." She said nothing. "I came to ask you to dance," he said. "Not out of courtesy. I want to be clear about that." The breath went out of her, slowly. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I am aware of what the season has arranged for you. Miss Lennox is a very agreeable young woman." "She is," he said. "That has nothing to do with what I am asking." "You should think about what you are asking," she said. "I have thought about it," he said. He looked at her steadily. "I have thought about very little else for 6 weeks." She held very still, Cecily. It was the first time he had used her given name. It landed in the silence he had built around it with the weight of something said once, and meant permanently. "There is a set being called," he said. "I would like to dance it with you. Not with you at the edge of the room, and not out of courtesy, with you in the center of the floor, in front of Lady Philippa Hurst, and everyone else who has been deciding what you were worth." The corridor was very quiet. She thought about the old cream silk. She thought about the 1/4-inch hem. She thought about the woman she had been at the Hurst ball 3 weeks ago, standing very still with her hands together and counting to 6. She thought about her father. "Yes," she said. He offered his hand. She took it. They came through the doors together. The room reorganized itself. This was not immediate. It happened the way a tide turns without visible drama, but with a completeness that could not be reversed. The dancers at the near edge of the floor shifted. Heads turned with the discretion that the season applied to things worth noting. Lady Philippa at the east windows went still, her fan arrested at the precise angle it had been holding. Miss Lennox watched from her side of the room with an expression that was not devastation, being 19 and resilient, and not, it turned out, particularly invested in one specific outcome. What she recognized was what it was, which was a man who had made up his mind. And she would find, in the seasons to come, that the experience had taught her something worth knowing. The Duke led Cecily to the center of the floor. He was precise and steady in his movements, and she was the same. And they danced without theatrical display, which was the correct register for what was being communicated. The dance itself was a country dance, which meant they faced each other and came together and separated and came together again. And each time they came together, she was aware of his hand at her back and the particular gravity of being looked at by someone who had decided something and was not going to undecide it. When the figure brought them close, he said quietly, "You are the finest whist player I have faced this season." It was such a particular thing to say that she almost laughed, which was not something she had expected to do tonight. And she did not quite laugh, but she felt it in her chest, where the cold had been living, and had moved something loose. "That is an unserious recommendation," she said. "You are not required to receive it as one," he said. And then, because the figure was separating them, he let her go. She came back to him twice more before the set ended. When it did, he kept her hand for a moment longer than the dance required, and the room noted it, and Lady Philippa noted it from the east windows, with the expression of a woman encountering the first situation in 40 years that had not arranged itself according to her expectations. "Alderton," Sir Edmund said, appearing at the Duke's left with the expression of a man deciding whether to speak or not. "Sir Edmund," the Duke said pleasantly. Sir Edmund decided not to speak. The evening's geometry had shifted, and everyone in the room understood what the shift signified, even if no one said it directly, which was the way these things worked. Lady Philippa did not repeat her assessment of the Threadbare widow for the remainder of the evening. She moved instead to the supper room where she sat with her circle and said several things about the unpredictability of gentlemen, which were true, but which carried less authority than they might have carried an hour ago. Agnes appeared at Cecily's side with an expression of controlled astonishment and the absolute discipline, not to say any of the things she was thinking. "Shall we have supper?" Agnes said. "Yes," Cecily said. The supper room was warm and lit with candles, and Cecily found herself at a table that had room for both Agnes and her husband, and a few minutes later for the Duke, who brought 2 plates from the table and set one before her without asking, and sat down across from her with the settled ease of a man who had decided where he wanted to be, and had gone. There she looked at the plate. It had been filled with care. "You know what I like," she said. "I observed you at 3 suppers," he said simply. She looked up. He was watching her with the quality of attention she had been trying not to trust for 6 weeks. And she thought about the codicil and the old shared solicitor, and the particular way he had sent the information through proper channels. And she understood, with a clarity that was not sentimental and not reckless and not at all the kind of understanding that could be explained to anyone who had not stood in a marble corridor counting to 6, that he had been looking at her for as long as she had been trying not to see it. "I should tell you," she said, "that I have £40 a year, and a returned gown." "I am aware," he said, "and a complicated solicitor situation." "That will resolve in the spring," he said with the calm of someone who had arranged for it to resolve in the spring. "You are very certain of yourself," she said. "I am very certain of you," he said. And then, because the supper room was not a private venue, and because he was a man who understood the difference between public declaration and private conversation, he did not say more. He picked up his fork and began to eat, and after a moment, she did the same. Agnes watched all of this from the other end of the table, with the expression of a woman having several simultaneous feelings that she was going to need some time to sort through. The evening wound toward its close. People found their wraps and their carriages and their conversations narrowed to the specific pleasantries of departure. Cecily stood in the entrance hall waiting for Agnes's husband to bring the carriage around, and the Duke found her there with her mantle pulled around her against the cold of the open door. "I will call on Friday," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. It was not an answer to a question. He looked at her for a moment. His coat was a deep navy in the candlelight of the entrance hall, and the white of his cravat was very clean against it, and the small scar through his left brow caught the light from an angle that made it visible. He was a man who had lost someone and had not permitted himself to move past it quickly. And she was a woman who had lost someone and had found that the machinery of the world had very little patience for that process. And they were standing in an entrance hall with cold air coming through the door, and the sounds of the evening's end around them, and there was nothing ceremonial about it, and it was, nonetheless, a thing she knew she would remember. "Good night, Mrs. Cavendish," he said. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. He went to find his coat. Friday came, as Fridays did, with no particular ceremony. The morning was gray and mild, and Cecily had borrowed Agnes's second-best sitting room and set a fire, and arranged herself at the desk with the letter from Mr. Burtis. Fen that she had been annotating in preparation for the upcoming meeting with Cartwright's replacement. Her hands were steady and her notes were precise, and she had chosen to wear the blue wool rather than the cream silk, which was a decision she had made without thinking about it, and which she examined briefly and then did not revise. He arrived at 11:30. She heard his name spoken by Agnes's footman, and she set down her pen and looked at the door. He came in carrying a book. She looked at the book. "Mr. Tell, Fen mentioned that you used the Harley Street Lending Library," he said. "There is a collection of essays published last spring that I thought might interest you. Your father wrote in the margins of my father's copy, which is how I know it was a habit he had, and which suggested it might be something you shared." She took the book. It was a volume on natural philosophy, and when she opened the front cover she saw her father's name written there in a hand she did not recognize, and then, beneath it, another name in a hand she did recognize as the Duke of Alderton's, and she understood that he had gone to some trouble to find a copy, and that the trouble had been deliberate, and that he had known. She would know that it was deliberate, and that this was how he communicated, through the material world rather than through declaration, through acts that required reading. She pressed the cover. "My father wrote in margins," she said. "As did mine," he said. "You might find the conversation worthwhile." She set the book on the desk. He sat in the chair across from her, and Agnes's sitting room was quiet around them, and the fire had found its proper heat, and they talked for an hour about the Cartwright matter and about Northumberland and about the natural philosophy collection and about the lending library and about absolutely nothing of consequence, which was to say everything of consequence. And when he stood to leave, she walked with him to the door, and he stopped on the threshold and turned. "Cecily," he said, the same way he had said it in the corridor once and permanently. "Yes," she said, the same way she had said it then. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, briefly her ungloved hand, and held it for a second with the particular pressure of a person who is confirming something rather than demonstrating it. And then he let it go. "I will call on Monday," he said. "Yes," she said. He went down Agnes's steps and into the gray Friday morning, and Cecily stood in the doorway and watched his carriage move away from the curb, and then she went back inside and picked up the book of essays from the desk. She opened it to a random page. Her father's notes were in the margins, small and precise, and underlined in two places where he had disagreed with the author's conclusion. And beneath his notes, in a different hand, the Duke's father had replied to the disagreement in a way that suggested her father had won. She turned several pages. The conversation continued for 40 pages. Two men of adjacent but different generations arguing through the margins of a shared book about the nature of things, observable and unobservable. Tate. And she stood in Agnes's sitting room with the fire settling behind her and read the conversation of two men who had not known each other well, but had known each other through the medium of careful attention, and she thought about what it meant that the man who had given her this book had read its margins with the same care. The codicil resolved in March, as Mr. Fen had said it would. The engagement was announced in April, in the small notice in the proper papers, and Agnes wept very briefly over her breakfast, and then composed herself and made several plans simultaneously, which was how she managed large feelings. The wedding was in May, a small church outside London, a day that began with thin cloud and ended with pale sun. Cecily wore ivory silk that had been made new, properly new, with seams that would not shift, and she carried a small spray of early summer flowers. And she stood at the altar beside him and said the words that the occasion required with the steadiness of someone who had thought them through. His hand covered hers at the exchange of rings. The church was not large, but what filled it was specific. Agnes in the second pew with her husband and her 4 children, the youngest of whom fell asleep during the sermon and woke to ask a question that caused a ripple of suppressed laughter. Mr. Fenn in the 4th pew, Mrs. Prow, Delaney in the 5th, who had said when she had heard the news that she had suspected as much from the whist table and was gratified to be confirmed, Miss Lennox, who had come with her mother and who gave Cecily a look of complete sincerity that Cecily received with something close to warmth. Lady Philippa Hurst was not in attendance. It was, in its way, a very quiet morning, and Cecily thought, standing beside her husband in the May light, that this was exactly what it should be. Afterward, in the carriage, on the road north to the Alderton estate in Hertfordshire where they would spend the summer, he put his arm around her, and she settled against him with the particular relief of a body that has been cold for a long time, and has at last found warmth and can admit it. She had the book of essays in her bag. She had put it there without thinking and confirmed it was there before they left. And it was there now, her father's notes and his father's replies pressed between its covers. She had decided she was going to answer some of them, in the margins when she had time. She thought her father would have found this perfectly logical. The Hertfordshire road was green in the May morning, and the hedges were in early bloom, and the light coming through the carriage window was the particular light of spring that is neither quite winter nor quite summer, and is therefore full of the feeling of things still becoming. Cecily watched it, and felt the 50 miles between London and the estate she had not yet seen, and she thought about £40 and £150 and a returned gown, and she thought about marble corridors and counting to 6, and she thought about what her father had written in the margins of another man's book, which was that the things most worth observing are the ones you must sit with a while before they come clear. She had sat with this one long enough. She reached into her bag and found the book by feel and set it in her lap, and beside her the Duke turned his head and saw it, and said nothing, only settled her more firmly against his side, and she opened the cover, and read her father's handwriting in the margins of the first page, and felt the winter in her chest, which had been living there for 14 months and some days, go quietly and completely out. If any part of Cecily's story has stayed with you this evening, let it rest where it has landed. This is what it was made for. The hedges of Hertfordshire moved past the window. The book lay open in her lap. She was at last precisely where she had earned the right to